Countries in the BRICS group and other global South nations have increasingly expressed dissatisfaction with the United Nations, pointing out several key issues. Chief among these is the perceived excessive influence of Western nations in major international organizations and decision-making bodies. These countries argue that the current UN structure does not adequately reflect their interests or perspectives, leading to calls for a more democratic and inclusive approach. During a recent BRICS summit, leaders emphasized the need for comprehensive reforms within the UN, highlighting the importance of enhancing the participation of emerging nations. Central to their demands is a re-evaluation of the Security Council's composition and reconsideration of the veto power held by its permanent members. This dissatisfaction has led to numerous calls for significant reforms, or even a complete overhaul of the UN, to establish a more equitable and representative system of global governance. In this video, we will explore these proposed changes and the motivations behind them. BRICS nations often perceive a significant bias within the United Nations and other international bodies that favor Western countries. This perceived partiality is particularly evident in human rights issues, where BRICS members such as China and Russia are frequently subject to criticism, while similar issues in Western nations receive comparatively less scrutiny. For example, Russia regularly faces condemnation for its human rights record, including its treatment of the LGBTQ+ community, and China for its actions against Tibetan human rights defenders. Yet comparable concerns in Western countries often escape the same level of attention on international platforms. A stark example of this double standard is seen in the treatment of refugees. European nations have been notably generous in their support of Ukrainian refugees, providing substantial resources and aid. However, refugees from other conflict zones, such as Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, have encountered harsher conditions and significantly less support from these same European countries. Similarly, in the Israel-Palestine conflict, international responses often appear unbalanced. While governments swiftly condemn Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians, there has been relatively muted criticism of Israel's severe retaliatory measures in Gaza. These measures, which have included cutting off essential supplies and using white phosphorus in densely populated areas, acts resulting in significant civilian casualties and considered war crimes, highlight the inconsistency in humanitarian responses. Organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have pointed out these disparities. BRICS nations argue that global governance frameworks, including the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, are disproportionately dominated by Western powers and fail to adequately represent the interests of emerging economies and developing countries. These nations claim that their increasing economic influence and geopolitical importance are not sufficiently recognized within these institutions' governance structures and policies. The BRICS bloc emphasizes that these institutions often mirror a post-World War II power structure, which no longer reflects the current global economic landscape. For example, the leadership of the IMF and World Bank has traditionally been held by individuals from Europe and the United States, perpetuating Western dominance in global financial decision-making. Many global South nations, including those within the BRICS group, believe that Western-dominated institutions impose stringent conditions on financial aid and development assistance that can undermine their economic growth and sovereignty. They argue that these conditions often prioritize Western economic and political interests rather than addressing the genuine developmental needs of recipient countries. For instance, these institutions frequently enforce austerity measures and economic policies that emphasize debt repayment and fiscal discipline over social and economic development. This approach has been widely criticized for reducing public spending on essential services such as healthcare and education, ultimately impeding sustainable development. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel for more videos about BRICS development, power and influence on the world. Let's continue now. Geopolitical rivalries, particularly those involving Russia and China, have intensified these concerns. Western actions, such as sanctions and political pressure, are often perceived as efforts to limit the influence of BRICS nations on the global stage, further deepening dissatisfaction with international institutions like the United Nations. China, for example, faces significant challenges with Western nations over its policies in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. Sanctions and other punitive measures imposed by the United States and the European Union are viewed as attempts to curb China's growing economic and geopolitical power, leading to heightened tensions and a sense of being targeted by the current international order. Furthermore, Western geopolitical strategies, such as forming alliances like the Quad, comprising the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, and AUKUS, comprising Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, are seen by BRICS nations as additional efforts to contain their influence. These alliances are perceived as countermeasures against China's rise and Russia's assertiveness, reinforcing the sense among BRICS countries that they are marginalized within the current international system. A particularly contentious issue is the allocation of voting power within the IMF, which remains heavily skewed in favor of Western countries, with the United States holding the largest share. BRICS nations argue that this does not accurately reflect the current global economic landscape, where emerging economies play a crucial role. For instance, as of 2020, China's GDP exceeded $14 trillion, making it the world's second-largest economy, yet its voting power in the IMF remains disproportionately low compared to its economic stature. BRICS nations contend that global climate change policies are often shaped by Western countries without sufficient consideration for the developmental needs of emerging economies. They argue that these policies sometimes place disproportionate burdens on developing countries, which are still working to overcome poverty and industrialize. While Western nations advocate for stringent emission reductions, BRICS countries stress the importance of financial and technological support to enable their transition to greener economies without stalling their growth. The COVID-19 pandemic further exposed the shortcomings of global governance. BRICS countries have criticized the World Health Organization, WHO, and other international bodies for what they see as a biased response that favored wealthy nations. Issues such as vaccine hoarding by rich countries and the slow distribution of vaccines to poorer nations highlighted the need for more equitable global health policies. Moreover, BRICS nations believe that current global trade policies are skewed in favor of Western countries. They cite issues like agricultural subsidies in the United States and Europe, which they argue distort global markets and disadvantage farmers in developing countries. The United Nations, UN, was established in 1945 following the devastation of World War II, with the primary objectives of maintaining international peace and security, promoting human rights, and fostering social and economic development. Founded on October 24, 1945, by 51 countries committed to peace and security through international cooperation, the UN Charter laid the groundwork for this new international order. The idea for the UN emerged from the failure of the League of Nations to prevent World War II, and the term United Nations was first used by Franklin D. Roosevelt during the war to describe the Allied countries. The UN Charter established 6 principal organs: the General Assembly, the Security Council, the International Court of Justice, the Secretariat, the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, and the Trusteeship Council. The General Assembly serves as a forum for all member states, while the Security Council, with its 5 permanent members, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, and 10 rotating members, is tasked with maintaining international peace and security. During the Cold War, the UN often became a stage for ideological conflicts between the Western Bloc, led by the United States, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union. Despite these tensions, the UN played a crucial role in various peacekeeping missions and decolonization efforts, significantly expanding its membership as many African and Asian countries gained independence. The UN established its first peacekeeping mission in 1948 with the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, UNTSO, to monitor the ceasefire in the Middle East. In 1948, the General Assembly also adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set out fundamental human rights to be universally protected. The end of the Cold War brought new challenges and opportunities for the UN. The organization became more active in peacekeeping and humanitarian efforts, addressing conflicts in the Balkans, Rwanda, and Somalia. The 1990s saw an increase in the number and complexity of UN peacekeeping missions, and the Rwandan genocide and the failure of UN peacekeepers to prevent it led to significant introspection and reforms within the organization. The UN also took on a greater role in promoting sustainable development and addressing global environmental issues. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro was a landmark event, leading to the creation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. In 2000, the United Nations adopted the Millennium Declaration, establishing the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, to be achieved by 2015. These goals focused on reducing poverty, improving health and education, and ensuring environmental sustainability. Building on the success of the MDGs, the United Nations launched the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, in 2015. This set of 17 goals aims to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all by 2030. Several proposals have been made for reforming or even replacing the UN. One idea is to create a new organization that better reflects the geopolitical realities of the 21st century. This could involve expanding the permanent membership of the Security Council to include countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa, which have significant regional influence and economic power. Another suggestion is to strengthen regional organizations such as the African Union, AU, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and the Organization of American States, OAS, to take on more responsibilities in their respective regions, thereby reducing the burden on the UN. Some experts advocate for a more networked and flexible approach to global governance, where coalitions of willing countries collaborate on specific issues, such as climate change or health, without relying on a single central organization. The dissatisfaction among BRICS and other Global South countries with the current international system, including the United Nations, is rooted in perceptions of Western bias and a lack of representation. These countries are pushing for reforms to create a more equitable and inclusive global order. While the future of the United Nations remains uncertain, these discussions highlight the need for a more balanced and fair international system that better reflects the diverse perspectives and interests of all nations. Which reforms do you think are most needed in the United Nations, and why? How do you believe the global balance of power will shift in the next decade? Let us know your thoughts in comments. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.